It's a familiar tale as far as urban legends are concerned. A young bride was tragically killed on the way to her wedding and was subsequently buried in her wedding dress. Typically in legends like this, the funeral took place on the day of her wedding. Following her burial, the ghost bride is seen sadly wandering the cemetery grounds at night. Despite it being a pretty common urban legend, finding a legend like this that also has the history to support it is fairly uncommon, which makes the story of Sunnyside Cemetery pretty unique. Most versions of this specific legend say that the bride was killed very near to the cemetery, which most likely helps to account for why, of all places, her ghost is said to be seen at the cemetery itself. Sunnyside Cemetery is the second oldest cemetery in Long Beach, formed in 1906, and has a fairly unusual history. Located near Willow Street and California Ave, right next to the Long Beach Municipal Cemetery, its 3.5 acres contain approximately 16,250 souls. Unfortunately for the people buried here, it would turn out that the cemetery sits directly on top of the Long Beach oil field. Many of those buried there prior to the oil-fueled cemetery wars, around 1921, were moved to other cemeteries. However, records as to where these people were moved were not kept. Due to embezzlement that occurred in the 90s, the cemetery has been in danger of closing for many years now. In order to help raise funds for the upkeep and care of Sunnyside Cemetery, the Historical Society of Long Beach holds an annual historical cemetery tour. I haven't yet been able to go on this tour, but I'm guessing that at least part of their tour involves the unfortunate tale of the ghost bride. While eyewitness accounts are incredibly difficult to track down, it is said that people driving past the cemetery at night have reported seeing the figure of a woman dressed in a white wedding gown wandering around the perimeter of the cemetery. The real story of the bride of Sunnyside Cemetery focuses on a woman named Bessie Mackenzie Baxter. Bessie was a 30-year-old woman who lived with her uncle turned adoptive father on Burnett Street in Long Beach. She worked at the Long Beach Laundry, was active in her church, and was well liked by everyone who knew her. Originally from Tingley, Iowa, she moved to California with her father around 1911. She was engaged to a shipyard worker named Corey Tingley. I have to think that the fact that his last name was the same of her hometown helped break the ice when they first met each other. At about 10:30 in the morning on Friday, September 20th, 1918, Bessie was on her way home from a shopping trip downtown. She was picking up some last-minute items that she needed for her wedding, which was to take place at 2 p.m. the following day on September 21st. As Bessie stepped off of a northbound Pacific Electric car, her arms most likely full of packages and her mind consumed with her upcoming wedding, she walked behind the car and stepped out directly in front of a southbound car. Unconscious and seriously injured, she was quickly picked up by two men, placed in a car, and rushed to Seaside Hospital, where it was found that the right side of her chest had been crushed, breaking all of her ribs, and she was suffering from other internal injuries. Later that evening, around 9:40, Bessie died from her injuries without ever regaining consciousness. The following day, the day that should have been her wedding, the minister who was going to perform the wedding was instead planning her funeral with her father and her fiancé. Her family was quick to absolve Pacific Electric from any liability, as they said Bessie was profoundly deaf and it was impossible for her to hear the oncoming train. A coroner's inquest that was held on the morning of her funeral came to the same conclusion. Bessie's death was simply a terrible accident. In her hurry and excitement, she forgot to look to make sure the path was clear. The local press was quick to follow the story and share some details about her funeral, including that she would be buried in her wedding dress, which they described as being a soft gray color. On Monday, September 23rd, Bessie's funeral was held at the Holton & Son Chapel, and she was then buried in the Sunnyside Cemetery. The cluster of white roses that she had purchased to be used for her wedding bouquet were instead placed upon her casket. Like with almost all urban legends, it's impossible to say how this one began. Most likely it was simply remembered by the locals as a horrible event that happened to a young woman just prior to what should have been one of the biggest days of her life. A sort of macabre warning for others to always pay attention to their surroundings, especially in traffic. And we all know that tragic romances make for some of the best ghost stories. Somewhat surprisingly, it didn't take Bessie's fiancé long at all to find someone new. Approximately 9 months later, he had remarried and moved away from Long Beach. Perhaps this is why her ghost sadly walks the cemetery grounds. Around that same time, Bessie's beloved father died and was buried right next to her. And this brings us to the end of the Ghost Bride of Sunnyside Cemetery. If you ever find yourself in Long Beach, near Sunnyside, keep your eye out for Bessie and maybe leave a flower on her grave. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'm Jennifer Jones. See you next time.